Well, good morning and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson. At Hudson, we believe that global security, prosperity, and freedom requires strong, engaged, and strategic American leadership at the heart of a vigorous network of allies. And for now more than half a century, we have analyzed both Soviet, Russian, and Russian nuclear rhetoric and weapons programs from the days of the Cold War, when our founder, Herman Kahn, encouraged thinking about the unthinkable, civil defense, and analysis of possible ladders of escalation to reduce the possibility of nuclear war, to pioneering work we did in the late 1970s, early 1980s on ballistic missile defense, to research more recently on what has been termed the second nuclear age. Our panel this morning, and I'm delighted that we have such a large crowd for a 9 a.m. panel on a somewhat gloomy-looking morning weather-wise. Our panel today looks at the disturbing new nuclear rhetoric and actions coming out of Moscow these days. As all of us know, in late August, Vladimir Putin offered a not-so-veiled nuclear threat against Ukraine, followed by numerous incidents in which Russian strategic bombers flew into both American and Canadian air defense space in recent weeks. And these actions and rhetoric occurred against the backdrop of an unprecedented announcement by Putin at a recent meeting of the Russian Duma in Ukraine and Crimea, at which the authorization of the basing of nuclear systems in Crimea was permitted, including long-range air-launched cruise missiles, Russian short-range ballistic missiles, and this occurred following an announcement in April that Russia might place tactical nuclear weapons in Crimea. Not only, obviously, would these actions violate Ukrainian sovereignty, but as a number of leading figures in Congress, Chairman Buck McKeon of the House Armed Services Committee, and subcommittee chairs Mike Rogers and Michael Turner wrote in a letter to the President, and here I paraphrase, they make a mockery of non-proliferation goals and give Russia an enhanced strategic advantage. To quote from this important letters from these members of Congress, locating nuclear weapons on the sovereign territory of another state without its permission is a devious and cynical action that further undermines Russian credibility in terms of the Budapest Memorandum that the Russian Federation signed in 1994. This Russian action would be ironic if it was not so threatening to global non-proliferation goals. It further positions Russian nuclear weapons closer to the heart of NATO, and it allows Russia to gain a military advantage from its seizure of Crimea, allowing Russia to profit from its actions. If Russia thinks it can gain advantages from such actions, it will continue them. It is also a clear and perhaps irrevocable tearing of the peaceful and stable security environment that made the founding act on mutual relations, cooperation and security between NATO and the Russian Federation of 1997, also known as the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And Chairman McKeon and subcommittee chairs Rogers and Turner wrote to the President expressing severe disappointment in the outcome of the NATO summit at Wales for failing to take vigorous action with regard to Putin's action and Putin's rhetoric. This morning our question is, what do we make of Putin's escalated rhetoric and the action that he's taking, coming at a time when Russia is clearly intent on nuclear modernization? Is this a new Russian foreign policy? What do these actions imply about the state of the American deterrent, and more broadly about the fate of the so-called nuclear zero movement? To analyze these critical questions and a number of others, we have a remarkable panel this morning of first-rate experts, each of whom will speak for between 10 to 15 minutes before we open it up to questions. Let me introduce all three, and then we will let each of them speak in turn. The first speaker is Andrei Piontkovsky. Andrei is a visiting fellow here at Hudson, but he is much more than that. Andrei is almost a figure out of Russian literature. He's one of Russia's last and leading pro-Western intellectuals, a brilliant mathematician, a graduate of Moscow State who's published over 100 articles on applied mathematics, but his attention moved from math to political science and politics some time ago as he became one of Russia's most outspoken political commentators, a fearless critic of Vladimir Putin, someone who once faced criminal charges in his own home country for more than 2 years, charges of extremism, and Andrei was eventually acquitted, but he certainly has had to fear for his life and still does. We are deeply honored to have him back from Moscow to address us today. Now, Andrei, when he came armed with props, and this is the latest clothing out of Moscow, and this is part of a campaign that is going on in which Russian citizens are being asked to trade in their English language T-shirts for Russian language shirts, and I will loosely translate. This says, "Sanctions don't make a mockery of my Iskander," meaning that just beware of what you're doing, because you could be elevating the danger of serious action by through sanctions. Yeah, meaning nuclear war, exactly. And this one is again, just makes fun of sanctions as well. And you can see you see the weapons on these T-shirts. You see the language, and you see the fact that these are being distributed to this is an ICBM, as Hudson trustee Kurt Windsor points out. So these T-shirts will become part of the official Hudson Institute clothing weapons clothing collection for further inspection after the panel. But it's a sign of just how serious things are getting in Moscow in this regard, and just how serious the rhetoric is. Our second speaker is going to be William Schneider. Bill Schneider is a senior fellow here at Hudson. He has deep roots here at Hudson, having arrived on staff as a newly minted PhD in economics the week that the Soviet Union marched into Prague in 1968. He worked closely with Herman Kahn on nuclear issues before Bill began an illustrious career in government as a top Senate aide, as an OMB defense official in the Reagan administration, as former Undersecretary of State in the Reagan administration, and as chair of the Defense Science Board under President George W. Bush. Bill Schneider is one of our nation's leading experts on nuclear issues, and he is currently undertaking a major new project here at Hudson on the second nuclear age. Our last speaker is Roland Freudenstein. Roland is Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wilfred Martens Centre for European Studies in Brussels, which is a proud partner of Hudson Institute. Roland has written widely on European defense and security issues, as well as alliance questions, in a long and distinguished career at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and as a member of the Foreign and Security Planning staff at the European Union. So we're delighted to have these three noted experts with us this morning, and I now have the pleasure to turn the microphone over to Andrei. After our three panelists speak, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So thank you very much for being here, and I want to thank our panelists. Looking forward to hearing their remarks.
Thank you, Ken. Any military strategy, including nuclear strategy, is generated by the political strategy of the state, by the set of ambitions, objectives, complexes, values of its leadership. So before addressing directly the subject of our panel, I am obliged to devote some time to this political motivation of Russian leadership behavior. All we remember the famous Churchill saying that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But fortunately, in our current situation, we have key to this riddle mystery enigma. Russian foreign policy is 100% conducted by one person, Vladimir Putin. So key to the Russian foreign policy and its strategy, it's a set of motivation and interest on this particular person. The highest priority, fundamental priority for Putin is just to stay in power forever. He watched what happened to Mubarak, and especially what happened to Gaddafi when they lost his power, and he determined never to leave the Kremlin. Until recently, until this Ukrainian crisis, Putin regime was authoritarian kleptocracy without much ideological pretensions. On foreign agenda, it just reacted to what he perceived as a threat for itself. And certainly the European aspiration of Ukraine, the European vector of policy were perceived as an existential threat by Putin's Russia, because success of Ukraine on this way would present undesirable example for Russian society. That's why first he tried to bully and to bribe Yanukovych to make him refuse of association agreement with the European Union, and then after Yanukovych kleptocracy, very similar to Putin's, were overthrown, he was determined to either submit Ukraine completely to his view or to dismantle it. And the first act on this agenda was annexation of Crimea, the act by which Putin's Russia broke a dozen of international agreements signed by our state. I think that Putin's Crimean speech, which he delivered in Kremlin on occasion of formal joining Russian Federation by Crimea and Sevastopol, was a political event even more important than annexation of Crimea itself. The task for Putin during this speech was to legitimize, to justify, or even to glorify the act of annexation. But he did much more. He did fulfill even more important mission for him. He designed a new ideology of so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world. No dictatorship can be based only on violence and intimidation. Prolonged dictatorship, they need some kind of ideology or mythology which would appeal to considerable part of population for considerable span of time, like Hitler ideology of superiority of German race, or Stalin ideology of communism. Many commentators of his speech, including myself, immediately note that Putin's Crimean speech was a remake of German Chancellor Hitler's Sudeten speech we had delivered on the occasion of annexation of Sudet. All main concept and even terminology of Nazi political foreign policy propaganda were borrowed in this speech. First of all, disunited nation. He said, informed us that we Russians are disunited nation. For the first time, this term was used on such a high level. Then he talked about, he justified Crimean annexation as gathering of historical Russian land. Then, what's even funny, he coined a new term for his opponent, national предатели, national traitors. It's absolutely new term. There was no such term in Soviet or Russian political vocabulary. On Soviets, opponents were castigated враги народа, enemies of people. And national traitors, national предатели, was purely Nazi terminology. And the most important concept, it was a concept of Ruski Mir, Russian world. Putin claimed his right and even sacred duty to protect not Russian citizens, but ethnic Russians or Russian language speakers all over the world. And to demonstrate that Crimea is only first step for promoting this Ruski Mir idea agenda, he immediately indicated another stage, and he coined one more new term, Novorossia. By Novorossia, he named 8,000 Ukrainian regions, which, to his opinion, were unjustly handed over to Ukraine after Bolshevik revolution. So now he created a long-term ideological system by which he could justify his rule forever, because it's very long-term program. It's much more comfortable. Any dictator, as I already know, needs such mythology. It's much more comfortable to him to say, I'm here in Kremlin to promote great Russia idea, than to say, I'm here in Kremlin just to make tens of billions of dollars for myself and my crony. And these were not just simple words. This hybrid war against Ukraine, which began, I think, even not from intrusion of polite green man to Crimea, but from his campaign, from his pressure on Yanukovych government a year ago to reject European friends. This war is going on, and it's going on now with its ups and downs. And as I already mentioned, the main objective here to control Kyiv, to control Ukrainian government, Ukraine as a whole. He doesn't need annexation of this two region, Donetsk and Lugansk. By the way, now he is most ardent supporter of territorial integrity of Ukraine, besides Crimea, of course. He needs to have this cancer tumor inside Ukraine territory to spread instability and chaos from it. But Kremlin propaganda offices present these events not as war of Russia with Ukraine. These Kremlin-speaking heads tell us every day on TV that it's much more. It's a war between Russia and the United States of America. And Ukraine is just terrain on which this war is developing. And even more philosophically, is a war between Ruski Mir, Russian war, and Anglo-Saxonian world. And Putin explained us also that we Russians, we have a unique genetic code, superior to genetic code of Anglo-Saxonian world, because Anglo-Saxons, they are mercantiles, they are thinking about their own enrichment, and due to our specific Russian genetic code, we possess much higher spirituality. And for example, one of the Kremlin guy, I call him Molotov-Ribbentrop grandson. It's Mr. Nikonov, grandson of Mr. Molotov. He even made historical historical discovery. He said that we Russians are Aryan tribe which descended from Carpathian mountain and spread all over the world until the Fort Ross in California. And corresponding element of all this propaganda campaign is a permanent reference to nuclear weapon. You saw this T-shirt, every statement of Putin, Shoigu, or Rogozin include phrase, don't forget that we're nuclear power. There was a scandalous performance and the meeting of top Russian official in August in Sochi, when Vice Speaker of Duma, Mr. Zhirinovsky, threatened to annihilate completely both Republic and Poland. And Mr. Putin was present there, and summing up the panel discussion, he very approvingly notes that Vladimir Wolfowitz always was very vivid and flamboyant, but maybe not all his words reflects exactly the policy of current government. Then the anchor of main TV weekly program, Mr. Kiselyov, boasted that we can reduce United States to radioactive ashes. What does all this rhetoric means? I think that Putin is rational and enough and informed enough to understand that yes, we can. We can reduce United States to radioactive ashes, but the cost of this pleasure will be to reduce ourselves to the same state. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction is still valid, and it prevents world from full-scale war. But Ken already mentioned the name of a classic of nuclear strategy, one of the founders of our institute, Dr. Herman Ken. And in his classical books on thermonuclear war and thinking about unthinkable, he taught us that the much more different scenario of limited nuclear war and adventurous nuclear power can try to reach some political objective by initiating limited nuclear war. And let's try, like Herman Kahn, to think a bit about unthinkable. Let's imagine that someday in Estonian city Narva, with predominantly Russian population, this Putin's polite green men appear, conduct referendum, and claim that, well, this part of territory is historically belongs to Russian board. Well, a year ago, annexation of Crimea was unthinkable, so we should think about this scenario. Estonian government, referring to Article 5 of NATO agreement, asks NATO countries to help. And if NATO countries help, their joint conventional might much stronger than Russian army. But at that moment, Putin publicly say and privately talk to his partners in Europe, okay, we realize that more powerful conventional force is ready to confront us in our agenda of Russian wars, and we warn you that we are ready to use nuclear weapon if these NATO conventional forces try to push us out from Estonia. What will be the reaction of Western politicians? It's very difficult to predict. I think that a vast majority of people both in Europe and in the United States would say we are not ready to die for Narva, like in certain European repeated, we are not ready to die for Danzig. So this situation will create an unthinkable choice for West, either humiliating capitulation, which would mean refusal to enter Estonia would mean end of NATO, end of Western alliance, end of the role of United States as guarantor of Western security. But providing its help, which would mean war with thermonuclear power. The only way to tackle this problem is to avoid it. And it's the only way, it's my last point, the only way to avoid this problem is to inflict defeat to this crazy idea of Ruski Mir just now and here in Ukraine, purely by economic and political instruments. West has all opportunity to do it and to prevent itself from facing this choice between capitulation and nuclear bomb. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrei, for those characteristically ominous yet very insightful comments. I have to say that every time I think that you're getting more ominous, you are, unfortunately, facts have proven you correct for the last 10 years since I've more than the past 10 years since I followed your writings closely. So thank you for that brilliant analysis. Let's turn it over to Bill Schneider.
Thanks, Ken, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm particularly reassured by the size of the audience. 5 years ago, it would have been difficult to get an audience a third the size we have now, and it would have been entirely composed of geezers. So it is rewarding indeed. I'm going to just address three subjects that are derived from the points that Andrei has just made about the implications of the increased aggressiveness of Russian foreign policy with respect to nuclear deterrence, arms control, and finally to the policy aspiration of nuclear abolition or nuclear zero. The increasing congruence of Russian foreign policy and the manipulation of nuclear threats is a serious challenge to the post-war order that tried to stabilize the use of and threat of use of nuclear weapons through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968. The aim was to create a new set of norms that would discourage or prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also to assure that the 5 countries that were grandfathered in as nuclear weapon states because they had tested nuclear weapons before the treaty came into force would also not use their nuclear advantage to threaten non-nuclear states. But a dimension of Russian foreign policy in the past, certainly in the past year, has much more aggressively coupled its nuclear power to its threatening of states in the region. And this in turn couples directly to the core of U.S. And indeed global non-proliferation policy, which is the credibility of the extended deterrent. Because the Russians have continued to integrate the threat of nuclear weapons into their foreign policy, it becomes increasingly important to countries that have abstained from the development of nuclear weapons to be confident that the U.S. nuclear umbrella will extend to deter the future threat or use of nuclear weapons by nuclear states, and in particular Russia. the rapid sequence with which the Russians have not only undertaken these threats, but have coupled it with action, is already having a destructive impact on the global norms created by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. 3 countries in Europe have already discussed the possibility of acquiring nuclear weapons: Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine. And this process is only beginning as the NPT becomes at risk as a consequence of these developments. The second set of implications that derive from the increasing aggressiveness of Russian foreign policy, particularly as it deals with weapons of mass destruction, is on the network of arms control agreements that have been put in place since the 1960s. I've already mentioned the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but perhaps the most troublesome dimension of this, certainly that affects the United States, is the impact of Russian aggressiveness on its nuclear modernization. It has undertaken a program of nuclear modernization that the Russian leadership intends to put in place by the year 2020. This nuclear modernization involves not only building new missiles, but a whole new generation of advanced nuclear weapons that are much smaller and lighter. And as a consequence, they are taking this great increase in the payload capacity or throw weight of its ballistic missile force and fractionating that payload among a much larger number of reentry vehicles, or the warheads that are contained on the missiles. This eye-watering increase in the scale of the threat posed to the U.S. Completely undermines the aims of the New START agreement, which were intended to be a first step on the road to nuclear abolition. As I said, when this agreement term is ended in 2021, the U.S. will be much worse off in terms of the strategic balance and indeed the coupling of U.S. Strategic nuclear power to the extended deterrent, which poses the kind of problems I mentioned at the outset. But while the New START treaty is the one that has the most immediate impact on the U.S., the Russian behavior has also produced problems for the credibility of 2 of the other major arms control agreements: the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement of 1987. The Russians have both tested a cruise missile of intermediate range that's supposed to be banned by the treaty. They've just brushed off U.S. concerns. The Department of State sent its senior negotiator to Moscow on September 11th, and her complaints were dismissed. No less troublesome is the recent test of a Russian ICBM that had a single warhead in it. The Russians then put 3 warheads on it, and that an additional weight reduced the range of the system so that it became an intermediate range nuclear missile. Again, supposed to be banned by the 1987 agreement, but again, the Russians have shown no interest in becoming compliant with the regime. The Chemical Weapons Convention, signed and entered into force in the 1990s, was supposed to bring an end to chemical weapons, and we, of course, have seen in Syria that the with Russian diplomatic cooperation, had agreed to get rid of all of its chemical weapons, but we got a bait-and-switch deal out of it, where they provided some precursor chemicals, but have refused inspections on either their facilities for manufacturing the chemical agents, or its residual stocks. The Russians have not chosen to cooperate further on this matter, and as a consequence, Syria has now initiated the use of toxic industrial chemicals that were favored during World War I, the use of chlorine as a chemical agent, and have used it with tactical success in its effort to suppress the revolt in Syria. Well, again, the problems created for how do you deter use when we're unable to deal with this situation in Syria. Other countries will almost certainly find this useful way of dealing with rebellious individuals, and the use of toxic industrial chemicals that are widely accessed, like chlorine. It's the one of the most widely used industrial chemicals, and is essential for water purification. So it's not like the chemical can be constructively banned, even though its use is banned as a weapon under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, rather the Chemical Weapons Convention. All of these things, these developments that are chipping away at the arms control regimes that have been put in place, are descending on what has been one of the core foreign policy pursuits of the current administration, which is its preference for a nuclear abolition, and to seek a sequence of arms control agreements that would progressively lead to the abolition of nuclear weapons. The efforts to impose this policy have produced a paradoxical outcome. The efforts that have been undertaken through the New START Treaty in particular to reduce or eliminate nuclear weapons and excise their role from international affairs has in fact created circumstances that will accelerate the nuclear proliferation problem rather than mitigate it. Perhaps the most compelling dimension of this is not that proliferation will increase among U.S. adversaries. There's already incentives for that to take place, and we've seen this in North Korea and in Iran, for example. But among nations that are friendly to the U.S. but are increasingly skeptical of the credibility of the extended deterrent. And the New START treaty, with its aspiration of nuclear abolition, I think is producing this paradoxical result, that we are unable to sustain the credibility of the extended deterrent without any effort to effectively modernize our forces. As you may be aware, every element of our strategic nuclear forces requires modernization more or less simultaneously. Our nuclear submarine force for delivering ballistic missiles, our ICBM force, heavy bombers, the air-launched cruise missile, and the nuclear command and control system all require modernization. The ballistic missile defense system has been built at a small scale and is not suitable if the threat is going to increase substantially, as may be happening as Russia becomes increasingly aggressive. So all of these things have to be taken more or less simultaneously, a feat that seems very difficult in the current fiscal environment, but nevertheless reflects this underlying paradox of the aspiration for nuclear abolition is in fact producing a much larger, much more dynamic, and much more threatening environment for nuclear weapons. And the cumulative effect of all of these developments suggests that we need some substantial change in the direction that we've undertaken with respect to our deterrent forces. The the Congress a year ago has created a panel to look into the entire nuclear weapons enterprise to find out what has happened to it in the past couple of decades since the end of the Cold War, and how we can build a more responsive complex that will, in fact, meet the needs of our foreign policy going forward. That panel is due to provide its report this fall, so that may perhaps converge well with the discussion we've been having here on nuclear weapons policy and arms control policy and so forth. So I think the U.S. policy is beginning to recognize that something is amiss, and the reintroduction of nuclear weapons as part of the environment in which our foreign policy will be created is now upon us, and we will need to respond accordingly. So I'll stop there and answer questions.
Bill, you've lived up to your reputation as one of the intellectual heirs of Herman Kahn, and I think all of us can see in your remarks why so many policymakers have relied upon you on these critical issues. Now, a pleasure to turn it over to Roland Freudenstein, who joins us from Brussels this morning. So, Bill only came in from New York, I think. So,
thank you, Ken. It's a huge honor to be speaking, especially here at the Hudson Institute. And the geek in me compels me to confess that Herman Kahn was one of the gurus of my teenage years. And I went to the school library, and I think I was the only guy who checked out Herman Kahn books there. And the Doomsday Machine and all this was hugely fascinating. And later on, during my political science studies, I did become a bean counter, as we called them in those days, calculating throw weights and talking about ranges and not mine. Okay. Second, let me just one clarification on the Wilfred Martens Centre. It's the think tank, or in German terminology, we would say the political foundation of the European People's Party, which is not as North Korean as it sounds, as I hasten to add for North American audiences. It's very simply the center-right in the European Parliament and, in a larger sense, in the European Union. So it's a political party family of 75 member parties, including observers and associates. Okay, now, having said that, let me come back to what Andrei initially said about Putin. I think it's actually unfair to accuse him of having been a KGB agent. It explains a lot in his case, but I would say dig deeper, look harder at his CV. What was he before he joined up? He was a street thug, a hooligan in the best sense, and he's proud of it. He calls it his street university. Masha Gessen, in The Man Without a Face, describes these years. He was like age 10, 11, 12, 13, in the backyards of suburban Leningrad at the time. Little extortion things, lots of violence, of course. And I would say, there are three things in what is happening now for which I find the best explanation in that part of Vladimir Putin's CV. First, being a rather skinny and not too tall fellow, he had to constantly, literally punch above his weight. Some call that asymmetrical warfare. That's a scientific term for it. But, to be aware that you don't have to be the stronger guy in physical terms. You just need to know where to apply the pressure at the right time. One thing. Second, always leave the other side an option. Like, punch him in the face and then say, well, now you have the choice. Do you want to escalate? You want to be stupid? Or you want to be rational and, sit down and negotiate? Well, or the equivalent in the thug days of Vladimir Putin. And the third, and that brings me actually to today's main topic, the third is a keen sense, a masterful sense of seeing fear in the eyes of the opponent, spotting fear in the eyes of the opponent. And he's richly rewarded in Germany these days. And when we go back to Andrei's description of Dmitry Kiselyov, arguably the most powerful man in Russian media these days, who on Sunday, the 2nd of March, that was right after it became clear that this was an occupation in Crimea. So on Sunday evening, 2nd of March, he went on national television and talked about this radioactive dust. There was a caption in the background in Cyrillic, radioaktivny papil, to which Russia can reduce the United States. And then there was an animation with silos and missiles coming out of the silos, and there was a mushroom cloud. That was primetime news in Germany the next evening, and it was the number one item on primetime news on German state television on Monday, the 3rd of March. Not enough with rendering the Kiselyov show. The journalists then went to a senior citizens' home and interviewed people about what it's like to live in war. And sure enough, these ladies and gentlemen said to the next and the generation after, don't do it. Anything, but no more war. So, from the hooligan perspective, I would say scored a point. Already achieved a small psychological victory by actually being aggressive and actually threatening more aggression, in this case, the ultimate form. So, the German debate is somewhere between not surrender yet. But the German debate is somewhere between, not even wanting to imagine the unthinkable, and on the other hand, thinking about nuclear force modernization behind closed doors, and let's please have no public debate about it. I mean, that's about it. So let me just give you the update on nuclear forces in Germany today. There used to be cruise missiles and Pershings and all kinds of tactical nuclear weapons, artillery shells and free-fall bombs and standoff missiles, and all this, a whole gamut of tactical and intermediate nuclear weapons. All this is gone. There are now, on the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany, 20 free-fall bombs of the B-61 type, which are aging fast. These are, of course, under American control. They would be carried into action by Tornado fighter bombers, which is a plane that was designed in the late 1960s. But according to the German government, will be operational for this mission because it needs a special variety of the Tornado. It will be operational for this type of mission until 2024. Now, the B-61s have to be modernized before that. In fact, there is a program put on track in 2012 where the life cycle prolongation, or whatever it's called, has been started.
Life extension.
A life extension, exactly. And these free-fall bombs will be modernized in due time, and it will be the B-61-12 variety. Now, as I said, I mean, all this is a conversation matter for maybe a total of about 100 people in Germany. And there is no public debate, and the government does not want any public debate about it. Don't forget that a major part of Germany's political culture, with at its core the Green Party, has protest against nuclear weapons, and especially against their deployment in Germany, at the core of their identity. The peace movement of the 1980s. This is now staple food for Germany's political culture. And that is why we are not having any public debate about this topic. And if it came, it would be extremely conflictuous for Germans. Now, NATO, in the meantime, continues to consider nuclear weapons as part of its arsenal, quite legitimately. I quote from the strategic concept for the defense and security of the members of the North Atlantic Alliance from 2010. As long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. There are other countries than Germany that have nuclear weapons on their territory. Again, these are only the B-61 freefall bombs, nothing else for the moment. Among them are Italy, Belgium, and I think 2 or 3 other NATO member states, which are also not happy with the fact that these nuclear weapons are there. But I think the first consequence of what we've just heard, what is coming from Russia now, is that the whole thing is frozen. Now, what is not being followed up, and maybe that's a good sign, here's the good news. There was a very publicized initiative of then German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle in 2009. He actually managed to get it into the coalition agreement with Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats to actually make Germany a non-nuclear country, to get rid of these last 20 freefall bombs and thereby render a service to posterity. Angela Merkel, in her classical style of, how should I call it, passive resistance in some cases, she let it be written into the coalition agreement, and then she said, but we can only do this in cooperation and in coordination with our NATO allies. So, nothing happened. Bombs are still there, and as much as I don't see any debate on on an extension of nuclear deterrence in Germany emerging in the next couple of years, I also don't see any continuation of the effort to get rid of these 20 weapons. They are going to be there, but to sum a long story up, their presence is quite literally symbolical. It is a psychological. It's a means of deterrence, but whether it's to what extent this is credible, actually, especially looking at the carrier systems, is a different question. Now, one last word about Poland. The Polish debate is, of course, in view of what happened in Crimea and Ukraine and what is happening in other countries of Eastern Europe. And it is also that one element of the 2009 Zapad military exercise by Russia in Belarus now takes on a very ominous character. If you remember, Zapad in 2009 was the exercise of Poland and Lithuania, don't laugh, Poland and Lithuania attacking Belarus for bad treatment of the Lithuanian minority. Actually, there are people who are saying, and now I'm not kidding, there are people who are saying that what was really exercised there was actually invading another country in order to protect an ethnic minority. So, the thing that if Zapad 2009 was ostensibly about defending against a ludicrous NATO attack, it was actually also about exercising such an attack, which then happened exactly 4.5 years later in Ukraine. But now comes the punchline. What did Zapad 2009 end with? The use of tactical nuclear weapon in Warsaw. A nuclear strike against Warsaw. Now, at the time, the Poles laughed it off. Now they take it much more seriously. And indeed, as Bill just said, there is a budding debate. I mean, it's in its very initial stages about nuclear weapons on Polish territory. And I'm formulating it exactly like this. I do not think any serious politician or even expert in Poland says Poland should acquire nuclear weapons. What some experts have started thinking about, have demanded in some cases, is for U.S. nuclear weapons to be deployed in Poland under the assumption that a country in which nuclear weapons are based is safer against conventional attack. That's the argument. But I tell you, you will not find a single statement of a government politician in Poland that even takes up this argument. This is a debate among some experts. There's a Center for Strategic Studies in Warsaw, which is very small, which started thinking about this, and you had immediate reactions from politicians saying that this is not on the table right now. Nevertheless, of course, I mean, if the Polish reaction about a TV program like Kiselyov and Radioaktywny Papiol is quite different from the German reaction. And yes, there is worry, there is fear, but I think anyone counting on Poland lowering its resolve to actually face up to Putin and to the new threat from the East, anyone who counts on them lowering that resolve is wrong. And I think we've seen it already the Poles didn't wait until Crimea to start massively modernizing their military forces, not with a primary goal of overseas use, but with a primary goal of territorial defense. And that program was put on track after 2008 Georgia. As Toomas Ilves, the Estonian president, likes to say, Georgia 2008 was a wake-up call, but we've been hitting the snooze button ever since. The Poles have not hit the snooze button. They have started, they will in 2 years' time, will have the largest standing tank force in continental Europe. And that's a consequence of Georgia 2008. And so the same goes for all aspects of the military threat up to the nuclear one. And I think in due time, I can see a more serious and more open debate even about nuclear weapons in Poland, but for the moment, this is not the case. So where does all that leave us? I don't dare to make a prediction about the nuclear aspects, but in general, if it comes to reacting to the threat from Russia, indeed, as Ed Lucas likes to say, we're in for a very, very, very long chess game here. And we have to see that, as chess is a zero-sum game, so is largely our confrontation with this new Russia, which is new in many aspects. And we'll have to confront Putin's Russia. We'll have to strengthen the Union, and I mean the European Union, and we have to rebuild the Atlantic Alliance. Nothing short of that. Thank you.
Very good.
Well, and let me thank you. The third of three spectacular presentations this morning. I will now turn it over for questions from the audience. Let me make a distinction between questions and comments. And so if you can keep your questions brief and direct them to one or more of the presenters, that would be appreciated. If we have time at the end of the question round, we will then open it up for comments. So thank you very much. And please identify yourself and offer your institution.
John Kunstadter, Radzima Photo. I'd like to return to something that Mr. Piontkovsky said about using the fullest measure of economic and political actions against what Putin is doing. Leaving aside what Andrei Larionov and others have said, that the only way to push Russia out of Ukraine is through military force, and leaving aside the question of whether one could find any leader in Washington or in Europe willing to use the full measure of economic and political measures against Putin, can you see anyone in the West ready to accept what the consequence of the full measure of economic and political measures will be, which will be the breakup of the Russian Empire? Thank you.
Well, there is not an issue of breaking up Russian Empire now. There is an issue of stopping this Putin's crazy and very dangerous idea of Ruski Mir in Ukraine. And what Roland has said only confirmed me in belief only confirm and believe that nobody in Europe is ready to die for Narva. And if Putin succeed in Ukraine, the hooligan will certainly go to boats. Not because he needs Narva. He needs to humiliate and dismantle NATO. So what is going on now in Ukraine decides the future of European and global security. And I agree with you that no Western power is ready to intervene militarily. It's for the first second of the conflict, both President Obama and NATO Secretary Rasmussen categorically stated that the military involvement will not be even discussed because they say Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But I believe that Putin's project in Ukraine can be stopped by three factors. First, Ukrainian resistance. Second, the growing anti-war movement in Russia. On Sunday 21st, the opponents of Putin and his policy in Ukraine assembled 50,000 Muscovites for march of protest. And administration tried in a week to demonstrate their support, and they try to assemble a comparable march using buses to bring students and workers, paying some fee for participation, but it was a catastrophic failure. Their number was at best on their own accounts 15,000. So we opponents of war are not marginals. We are majority in active minority. Well, most people always either indifferent or not active enough. The history is made by active minority. And the events in Moscow this month demonstrated that active minority of opponents of war is larger than active minority in spite of all Kisilov of the vote. And the third factor, it's economic sanction and political isolation of Putin and his entourage by the West. And I think that one action will be very efficient. Everybody knows that Putin and his people around him are multi-billionaires with assets in the West, and your financial intelligence knows very well these assets. And freezing and publicly exposing these assets would be a very good measure for affecting Russian public opinion. Let Russian people know who are these gentlemen who promote the great idea of so-called Ruski Mir. I think that combination of these three factors is able to defeat, to inflict defeat on Putin in this hybrid war in Ukraine.
Hi, my name is Chuck Manto. I have a small critical infrastructure company here in the U.S., and I'm active in an FBI-sponsored program called InfraGuard. I have sort of a two-part, an internal-external question about Ukraine. Since the historically divided Ukrainian churches appear after the fall of Crimea to, for the first time, become more united, do they comprise some kind of a force to challenge the myth of the Russian world from an internal perspective? And would their brethren in Russia take to heart their concerns? That's an internal question. And then secondly, would Europe just say, for the sake of peace, let's just, we don't really care all that much about Ukraine. It's been sort of Russian. They sort of talk the same language. And would they just use that as a peace offering, so you can have it as long as you leave the rest of us alone? Or would they really see that as one more move towards the threat towards Europe as a whole, even without any U.S. participation at all, to sort of back them up?
Sure, yeah, okay, I'll start with the second part. That's the billion-dollar question that you asked. I wish I had an answer to this, but that's what institutions like mine are now fighting for, is to say, look, what's happening in Ukraine is a direct threat to us, to our core values, and in fact, even to the European Union as an organization. Because if Putin has his way, both NATO and the EU will lose their current meaning as organizations providing stability, security for their own members, right? Not to mention the external function of, extending stability in the case of the EU with neighborhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, and all that. So, we are fighting for the European Union itself here. And so, aside from that, Putin has begun pushing out all Western influence from what he defends, what used to be called the near abroad, and is now Ruski Mir. And I think, for the sake of our core values and the right of nations to determine their own future, both in terms of their internal structures, rule of law, democracy, but also in terms of their allegiances, their alliances, we have to take up the struggle, and it will be a very, very long one. But that's not the only opinion in the European Union. And of course there are people who are saying, what do we care? This is, some very prominent former chancellors of the Federal Republic and foreign ministers and so on are openly saying that, hey, we stepped over their red line. We stepped over Russia's red line by NATO enlargement, by missile defense, and last but by no means least, by somehow making the Ukrainians sign an association agreement with the European Union. So we got into their backyard, and now we are paying, and the poor Ukrainians are paying the price for our stupidity. I'm paraphrasing, okay? But this argument is around, and we have to take it seriously. And the debate is not over. We're just beginning, and it will be a long, hard struggle within the West and within Europe. Now, without the U.S., no way. I do hope that this whole contingency that we're in is the end of the pivot, or later it was called rebalancing. I mean, even if you wanted to continue the pivot to Asia, a pivot takes an anchor, as Wes Mitchell from SIPA always says here in Washington. If you want to turn, you got to have a stable point around which you turn. That stable point should be the democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. So, to make a long story short, the jury is out on whether Europe will see things that way, but the Martens Centre is one of the institutions that are fighting hard to get this point across.
Well, not only unity of Ukrainian churches, but the unity of civil society in Ukraine as a whole impressed Russian thinking very, 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 very strongly. What is most important that Putin administration failed to present
He hadn't turned on.
these events in Ukraine as an ethnic war between Russian and Ukrainians, because everybody said that a lot of people who are fighting on Kiev side, not only Russian speakers, all of them Russian speakers, they are ethnic Russians. So this main Putin mythology on Ukrainian events presented it as rebellion of Russian ethnic who were persecuted and so on. This mythology was completely collapsed, and it has changing mood in the country. I already mentioned this testing of 2 matches in Moscow, and I think this testing is more indicative that all so-called opinion polls. The fact that we are many, and was quite a surprise for us, because every day from TV we heard that 84% of people are supporting Putin policy. Well, 90 rating of President Ceausescu was 97 2 days before he and his wife were shot as dogs on the street of Bucharest. So the real testing is a comparison of number of citizens who are ready to express their position actively.
Question in the back, sir. Yeah, there right.
Mitchell Pullman. In Soviet times, the defense sector, well, the entire Soviet economy was autarkic, including the defense sector. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's developed economic ties with the West. Things have changed. Much of the what was the Soviet defense industry is now in Ukraine. So given all of that, what effect are sanctions, both those imposed by the West as well as self-imposed by Russia? How realistic would it really be for Russia to rearm, given that so much of their technology in recent years has come from the West, and so much of what used to be their defense sector is now located elsewhere?
Yeah. Bill, do you want to?
So a few points. First, Russians have been moving a lot of the defense industrial capability that they had previously depended on out of Ukraine into Russia. For example, the large SS-18 type storable liquid ballistic missiles that used to be assembled in Ukraine are now going to be the new variant is going to be built in Russia. But there still are quite a few limitations, and Russia is, from what's evident in the Russian press, are scrambling to try and restore all of that capability to Russian territory. But I think with respect to nuclear weapons, they are probably and nuclear and delivery systems, they are probably less dependent on sites outside of Russia than is the case with other parts of their defense establishment, which were more widely distributed and included sites in Ukraine, Belarus, and even in the Baltic states.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I wonder if the panel could speculate on what Putin's motives would be for crossing a line on the INF treaty. And I'm just wondering if it could be, in fact, that he's trying to provoke the U.S. to withdraw from the treaty. There are two assumptions behind my question. One is that it's not the Rubej new ICBM that we're complaining about, because, in fact, that would be counted. Every one of those warheads would be counted under the New START treaty. For every one of those warheads, the Russians would have to not have one of their other ICBM warheads that could attack the U.S. We're worried about the new cruise missile there, and we assume that with the hundreds of delivery vehicles and thousands of nuclear weapons, there is no target that a new cruise missile could attack with a nuclear weapon that can't be attacked with the existing arsenal. So what was Putin doing?
Well, I'm sure there's quite a few opportunities that might explain it, but at least things that have been explained in the Russian news media is that the Russians have said that they have target sets that for which intermediate range systems would be required. The U.S. does not. They have been for several years uncomfortable with the constraints imposed by the INF agreement. Also, since the end of the Cold War, the Russians have had an aggressive program of modernizing their theater nuclear weapon designs. They have moved out of the very or relatively high-yield theater systems to ones that are more appropriate to highly accurate delivery systems. So I think we are seeing a modernization of the theater weapons, and as was mentioned about Russian exercises, they are actively including the use of theater weapons in their exercises, in addition to the Zapad 2009 exercise, the current Vostok 2014 exercise in the Russian Far East also includes playing the use of nuclear weapons in the field. So I think for the Russians, the INF treaty is a limitation that actually constrains them, and I suspect their complaint is about the U.S. violations as being parallel to this one, suggests that the Russians are anxious to get out of the INF treaty for their own reasons.
I think that shortest answer to the question about desire of Russia to leave intermediate missile treaty is China.
Okay. We go over here, and then the fellow behind you. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take 3 questions in a row, and then because we have to wrap up in the next. So why don't we go there, and then why don't we do this row? Yeah. But 3 questions in a row, and then we'll wrap things up since we need to wrap up by 10:30. Thank you.
I am Salih Al-Khatran, King Saud University. I have 2 quick questions. First, to all the panelists.
Well, I don't.
How do you see?
We can't hear you. I'm sorry. Is the
Mike,
microphone on?
please.
Yes.
Mike.
My name is Salih Al-Khatran. I come from Saudi Arabia, King Saud University. 2 quick questions. First, to all the panelists, how do you see this new Russian nuclear policy affecting Russian position towards the negotiation with Iran? Do you see Russia serious about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon? That's first question. Second question to Professor Andrei. On this concept of Ruski Mir, do you see any role for the Russian church? Is there any cooperation between the church and the Kremlin in pursuing this policy of Ruski Mir? Thank you.
Okay, that's yeah. Thank you.
2 questions. One is to Bill and Roland. Having in mind words of Mr. Obama, who said Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine, and words of Angela Merkel, Ukraine is free to do what they like, but not to harm Russia. Having in mind these statements and the decisions of, or known decisions of Wales Summit, should we understand that it is a tacit approval and acceptance of the spheres of interests for Russia, spheres of privileged interest that Mr. Medvedev and Putin proclaimed, and Ukraine is part of this sphere of privileged interests? And the question to Roland, based on your elegant description of psychological portrait of the main hero, would you say that economic sanctions to remote friends of this hooligan would help to stop his bullying behavior?
And the last question, yeah.
Peter Volkovitsky, retired government employee. I have a question to Andrei. You mentioned that Putin was always against the Western way for Ukraine. If we imagine for a moment that this plan would realize and Ukraine would get some support in the form analog to the Marshall Plan for Germany, we could come to the situation in 50s when there were 2 Germanys, East and West, and there was a big flow of active people from East Germany to West Germany. Do you think that this menace was considered Putin seriously in his policy?
Okay. Why don't we begin with the Iran question, and then,
Concerning Iran, the Russian interest seems to be served by not having a success in the current round of negotiations. It keeps the United States busy in trying to manage the crisis. It provides an important source of influence into let's say the Persian element of the Middle East, which of course is coupled to the through the Shia regimes in Iraq, Syria, and southern Lebanon to give them a grip on the Levant, or from the Levant to the Gulf. So I think Russian interests have evolved as relations with the U.S. have deteriorated, and I think they are not going to be helpful in securing an agreement with Iran.
Okay, just this point, will sanctions stop him? I don't think it's a question of stopping him or making him turn around tomorrow. Even when his friends start prodding him, but my guess, and Andrei knows much more about this, is that indeed power is pretty much concentrated in the hands of Putin, and whether this or that friend calls him up at night and says, my wife is giving me a hard time because she can't go shopping on the Champs-Élysées anymore, or we can't, spend our vacations in our villa in Cyprus. I mean, I really think this is not going to have an immediate effect. But, in the good old hooligan situation, it's not important black or white, yes or no. It's important to increase the cost of certain things. And we have seen over the past couple of months that Putin does take into account the cost of his actions. And he does try to stay below a certain level, which he defines as the West's red line. And he certainly tries to stay below that because he doesn't, because he's not happy about the sanctions, and he doesn't want more of that. And this is something that we should use much more to our advantage, or to the advantage of the values we believe in, and the Ukrainians for whom we want to do something here. And that just brings me to this other point about spheres of interest. That's the problem I have with the term geopolitics, which has been really overused in the last 6 months, I believe. If geopolitics, in the good old Napoleonic sense, means la géographie, c'est le destin des peuples. Geography means that nations can't evade their geographical location. If that is geopolitics, I'm against it, and I think it's totally opposed to what we stand for. So spheres of interest, it cannot get in the way of the ability of nations to define their own system and their own alliances. If that's geopolitics, I'm against geopolitics. But I mean, to take geography, culture, history, and all that into account when we do something or plan something, I mean, that would, for me, would be the positive side of geopolitics as a strategy element. But I don't. It's true. Merkel does a lot of things and says a lot of things these days because she has to keep the coalition peace at home. And she has a coalition partner who is just barely getting rid of their total illusions about the strategic partnership with Russia. They're really coming out of a long dream there, and it's very painful. And she's not the type to pick a fight with her social democratic coalition partner. I think she herself has a very, very solid instinct about Mr. Putin and about Russia at the moment. But she has to prevaricate, and she has to be careful sometimes. But having said that, I reject the tone of the statement that Ukraine shouldn't do anything to harm Russia. I mean, it's I think it depends on where and when you say it, but she shouldn't have said that.
Okay. Andrei, for the last word.
Well, Church, yes, Russian Orthodox Church participating in this project of Ruski Mir. One of the ideological supporters of this agenda. About sanctions, well, the sanctions affecting not only hooligan psyche, they are affecting psyche of many other people, people around him who are asking the question why we should lose billions of dollars, as they already lose billions in capitalization of their assets. And what's more important, Andrei, and you as one of our brilliant economists know it's better than anybody else, that they affect Putinomics. And Putinomics is doomed. It's not, because it's not market economy. The fundamental element, private property, is absent. Property of any ordinary person, oligarch, is conditional. It depends on its administrative resource of its relation with president or local policeman, and latest example with Mr. Yevtushenkov demonstrated one again. And I think that without any sanction, this Putinomics will collapse in matter of years at longest. But sanctions, they accelerate this process. No doubt about it. And that's why I think they're very important.
Well, that's the most optimistic note we've heard this morning. I want to thank everyone. It's been an absolutely excellent panel and lots of very important questions raised. And these questions are something we're going to continue to look at here at Hudson through Bill Schneider's work on the second nuclear age, and through Andrei's important work, and we look forward to having Roland back with us before terribly long. Thank you for coming, and I also want to thank the Hudson Public Affairs team for doing such a great job pulling this event together. Thank you.